I often seek and definitely enjoy calm and silent places. However, in the city where I live and that I love, it is rather hard to find real silence. A headset with noise cancellation is then the next best thing, and I use those a lot. I very much need silence for the kind of work that I do, and although silence is good for me, I never really took the time to try and understand what silence actually is and why is it so important to me or to us humans in general. Therefore, in this episode, I make an attempt to search for silence, and of course I'm going to read about it too. And as always, I'm looking forward to share with you whatever I will find. Welcome back to Bold Books and Bones. When I learn about a topic that I don't know much about, like I'm learning now about silence, then in my mind I imagine that I step into a labyrinth with books in it. I start with reading one book about the topic, and that book will then guide me via footnotes and references to another one, and so on. And just like in a real labyrinth, I follow the path, not really knowing how many turnings there will be. Since a labyrinth has an ancient history of being a place to practice introspection and reflection, it seems to be the perfect tool when embarking on a search for silence. The first thing I do when entering the labyrinth in my mind is asking myself what I might already know about a subject. As a psychologist, I'm quite familiar with one particular kind of silence that I frequently use in my work. It is the one that emerges, for example, when a conversation between two or more people stops. And suddenly there is this moment of silence. I'm sure you have experienced such moments too. You probably also have noticed that there is information in that particular silence. Because when it happens to us, it can communicate that we feel so comfortable with the other person that words just don't add anything to that moment. But it might also communicate anger or disappointment, depending on the context. Because of the meaningfulness of this moment, it is sometimes called the silence of Hermes, referring to the ancient Greek god of communication. So silence in this regard is not something passive, but instead an active part of our communication. Now, that is probably all I can say about the role of silence in my life, besides the fact that I like silent places. And therefore, I was of course looking for books to learn more. In my bookcase at home, I found this unread book called A History of Silence from the Renaissance to the Present Day by Alain Corbin. The book opens with a clear statement. Silence is not simply the absence of noise. We have almost forgotten what it is. The first chapter is called The Silence and the Intimacy of Places. And he writes, there are specific places where silence makes its subtle omnipresence felt, where it can be more easily heard. And he continues, among the places where silence particularly makes itself felt are certain specific buildings such as churches, libraries, castles, and prisons. So I thought, let's not only read about silence, but let's try to experience what Alain Corbin is writing about. And I was lucky because a dear friend of mine was so kind to take me with him to stay for a weekend in the Abbey of Chevetogne in the south of Belgium. It is an active abbey, and one of the many beautiful aspects of this peaceful place is that it is the home of two church traditions. There are monks living side by side from the Eastern Byzantine tradition and monks from the Roman Catholic tradition. Now, this episode is not about a specific religion or belief. I could have chosen any other place, and I respect all world religions. For now, I choose to stay in this part of the labyrinth, and I was particularly interested in how I would experience silence during my visit to this community where it plays an important part in their existence. Before arriving at the Abbey, I took off my smartwatch and deactivated all my notifications on my smartphone so I would not get distracted by the buzzing sounds of messages that frequently pop up on these devices. And I prepared for very little online time. When we arrived, we were welcomed by a friendly monk called Brother Gabriel, who showed us to our rooms. Once you enter the building, the first thing that strikes you is its silence. My normal daily noise experience goes something like this. In the Abbey, however, you suddenly hear clearly your footsteps and the movements of your clothes while you walk. And when you go outside, the silence continues and is enhanced with the sound of birds and the sound of the wind. This is the room where I stayed, and to give you an impression of how silent this room is, just listen for a moment. There will be a sound soon to show the contrast. I think that perhaps this is what Alain Corbin meant when he writes that there are houses that breathe silence, where it seems to permeate the walls. And then in the chapter called The Speech of Silence, Alain Corbin points us to its communicative power. He quotes a Romanian-French playwright called Eugène Ionesco, who once wrote that words stop silence from speaking. I like the way he puts this. I think that there are many occasions where we can't listen to silence anymore, or where we never really learned how to do it. It is just too easy now to get distracted by a never-ending flood of words, sounds, and images that are pushed to us via algorithms to our smartphones and our other devices. While sitting alone in my room in the guest house in the Abbey, I felt at times the weight of silence. I read in Alain Corbin's book that silence speaks to us, whether it is soothing or unbearable. I hardly go on internet, and for many hours there is no social media stream, no email, no YouTube, no Netflix, and no Instagram. So the many impressions that I access every day via these channels are silenced too. And also the furniture in the room, the food that you eat at the Abbey, everything is sober or temperate and has therefore a beautiful quietness of its own. In this Abbey, silence seems to be at the center of it all. No noise cancellation headset is needed, which is so nice, and I could concentrate on my work for hours. I also slept incredibly good. And in the early morning, it was 6 a.m., my friend and I attended a Byzantine morning service. It is called Orthros, which is Greek, and I learned that it means early dawn or daybreak. Because it is so early, everything is even more peaceful, calm, and silent. The place where the monks gather for Orthros has little light. Most of it is coming from a few candles. There is a serene atmosphere, and the monks are reading aloud the liturgy in a chanting way. Although there is obviously sound, I experienced a comfortable feeling of silence and calmness in my mind. I lost a bit track of time and could not really say if the service took 30 minutes or longer. And I always like these moments where I lose track of time, because to me these moments are good moments. Staying in this abbey was a valuable experience, and I got a first small glimpse of this particular atmosphere of silence. The monk, whose name is Mr. Lambrechts and who is responsible for the library, was so kind to show my friend and me the scriptorium and the private library underneath the abbey. Libraries and scriptoria are both spaces that are, of course, interwoven with silence, and therefore it was no surprise that this impressive library was part of the daily life and work of this community of monks. This abbey was a peaceful, silent and welcoming place, and I'm very grateful for the invitation by my good friend and for the kind hospitality that we experienced from the monks. Now, back to the Labyrinth and to the book by Alain Corbin. I very much liked the part in the book where he writes about paintings and about the silence or the sounds that they can evoke in our minds. I love paintings, but I never thought of trying to listen to a painting. The author is not the first one who points out that in these times we look at paintings with mostly aesthetic considerations in mind, and that is of course perfectly fine. However, in earlier centuries, when sounds could not be recorded, people would not only look but also contemplate in a more general way about a painting. They would have included all its possible elements of what is shown on a painting. This is a new thought to me, and it makes absolutely sense, and it is easy to do. If we look at a painting, for example, this one by one of my favorite painters, whose name is Pieter Bruegel the Elder. What would we hear if we take the time to listen to what is happening? Would we hear the sound of the children playing on the ice? Would we hear the hunters walking on the snow? Can we hear the wood burning in front of the house or the birds flying in the sky? To me, this is a nice way to slow down our minds and to take the time to enjoy and to see maybe more than what might be seen at first sight. Alain Corbin summarizes this very nicely when he says, "Images are silent, but they speak in silence." What I like very much about this book is that he touches briefly on many different aspects of silence, and therefore, to me, it is a perfect start in my search to better understand what silence might be. At some point, Alain Corbin pays in his book particular attention to a remarkable person, whose name is Maurice Maeterlinck. I knew very little about this man, although he is a Belgian writer who received in 1911 the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he is probably best known for his story called The Bluebird, which was a global success for decades, and at least 5 movie adaptations were made about this story. However, Alain Corbin mentions a particular text by Maurice Maeterlinck that is far away from his other stories and theatre plays. It is called The Treasure of the Humble. It is a text where the author reflects on life and its meaning. The first chapter is dedicated to silence. And at the beginning of the chapter, we read, and I quote, "From the moment that we have something to say to each other, we are compelled to hold our peace. And if at such times we do not listen to the urgent command of silence, we shall have let slip the opportunity to listen to another soul, and of giving existence, be it only for an instant, to our own." I find this exceptionally beautiful. He continues to explain that two souls can only know each other through silence. And he writes, "As gold and silver are weighed in pure water, so does the soul test its weight in silence. And the words that we let fall have no meaning apart from the silence that wraps them round." This book adds to me a total new perspective on what silence is and what it can mean to us. In thoughtful sentences, the author shares with us his most profound ideas on life, and maybe we might not agree with everything he says, but at least Maeterlinck's thoughts provoke reflection in a way that we might not be used to. I'm happy that I found this beautiful text, which seems to be written to make the reader think or even contemplate on what could be called a spiritual view on life. Now, the next book that I encountered in the Labyrinth is called Silence, a Social History of One of the Least Understood Elements of Our Lives. The American author Jane Brox brings yet another take on the subject. We could say that she examines the bright side and the dark side of silence, because she looks at silence as part of religious and spiritual traditions in monasteries, but she also examines silence as a dark force used in prisons to punish inmates. In her book, she provides a lot of historical context on the two competing meanings of silence, which I found very enriching. And then in part 4 of her book, she surprises with chapters on the silence of women from a historical perspective. She describes how through the ages, at least in the West, women were not supposed to speak up, and even the legal system did not give them a voice. It is a very informative book. The author, Jane Brox, is to me a bit like an archaeologist, but instead of uncovering buildings and artifacts, she uncovers for us silence as an intangible part of our human communities. And she describes what silence meant in the past and why it is still relevant today. I'm entering the last part of the Labyrinth to engage with a book by the Norwegian explorer Erling Kagge. He is the first person to reach the North Pole, South Pole, and the summit of Mount Everest on foot. Now, because he was frustrated by his daughters that they couldn't put aside their smartphones during dinner, he wrote this intriguing booklet called Silence in the Age of Noise. And he formulates 33 attempts, as he calls it, to answer the questions: what is silence? Where is it? And why is it more important now than ever? I liked very much how he talks about the silence around us, but also about the silence within us. And he is confident that it is possible for everyone to discover this silence within themselves. He points out that the silence within us is there all the time. Another reason why I bring up this book in this episode is because the author Erling Kagge adds an additional and original perspective on the topic, because he does not regard silence as an renunciation or something spiritual, but rather as a practical resource for living a richer life. We could say that he has a pragmatic view on silence. He brings these interesting thoughts to the reader's attention. He talks about silence as part of music, silence as seen by some philosophers like Wittgenstein and others, and silence that is deprived from us through the many apps that adopted addiction as an explicit commercial strategy. Also, it is a beautiful designed booklet. I very much respect the work of Erling Kagge, Jane Brox, Maurice Maeterlinck, and Alain Corbin, because each of these authors engaged with the difficult task to describe in words something that is so intangible as silence. Their words helped me at least to have a first understanding of something that I took for granted. I arrived in the center of the labyrinth. The journey ends for now. In a labyrinth, it is never the purpose to rush to the center and then to rush back. Instead, they are created to consciously experience the journey and to contemplate on whatever comes our way. Thank you for watching this episode of Bold Books and Bones. I hope you find this episode worthy of your time, and I hope to see you in the next episode. In the meantime, please stay curious and stay free. Bye for now.